again, I think there is this tendency towards narrowing. For instance, there are many varieties of English. Everybody knows that. And the boarding school I went to was in Scotland. And what they did was to make certain that they didn't have 5 boys who spoke Hindustani sharing a dormitory. There would be 2 who spoke Hindustani and 2 who spoke something else, and 1 boy who only spoke Scottish. And the result of that was my natural accent was Doonhamer, kind of braid Scots, and I can still talk it. That's my native dialect, you might say. And although I tried to conceal it, people who listen to me carefully can hear that I didn't speak entirely the same as someone who spoke proper English from early years. I could describe the differences, but I remember once being caught out by a German philologist who listened to me talk and said something like, it is surprising that your basilect, that's your basic accent, is so clearly Scottish. And I thought, well, I didn't tell him that, but he is correct. Well, that though, that sort of thing has been rather ironed out. Sorry, the telephone is ringing. It will go off in a minute. I mean, my parents also had quite a distinctive accent, and these are still present. But where I live now, I very rarely hear anyone speak with the old accent of 100 years ago. It's been wiped out by television, radio, and of course also population spread. The way that accents are preserved is if there are a lot of people who all speak the same way and they don't go anywhere. And this is also a threat to minority languages, such as Welsh or Scottish Gaelic, which are still spoken in the British Isles, but not very much. And I think in the same way, or in a similar way, there's a tendency for styles to be simplified, so that once upon a time we had a high rhetoric, which is spoken by people like Churchill, and there was a vulgar language, which is spoken by 90% of the population, and in between there was Oxford English or BBC English. But now these are all, they've all become more similar to each other. Someone like Tony Blair, our former Prime Minister, made a point of trying to speak with a popular style and a popular accent, and he wasn't very good at it. It was phony, but he tried to level himself down. That kind of lack of ambition, I think, is probably, I think that's rather unfortunate. I'm often surprised by how badly our leaders communicate. Their grammar isn't very good, because they don't know any. There we are. Well, my colleagues and I do what we can, but Tolkien, I think is it Elrond? Someone says to Galadriel, through the ages, we have fought the long defeat. And actually trying to keep philology alive in universities, that in my life and in Tolkien's has been a long defeat. We always lose. So slowly the time given to it shrinks and shrinks, and the number of people who understand it shrinks and shrinks. And that I think is a misfortune. We just have to try and keep the knowledge alive and hope that one day perhaps it may be revived. But I can't see it happening, I'm afraid. Once again, we have this narrowing, and there's no space for minority languages, and everybody must speak English or French or German. And I have lots of books, as Tolkien did, in minority languages like Catalan and Gallego and Mallorquin. These are all, I'm going to say, variants of Spanish, but they aren't. They're independent languages, but not many people speak them anymore. But you get a very good effect if you do speak them. I go to Mallorca on holiday and I speak some Castilian Spanish, but I always try to use some Mallorquin words, and people are surprised to hear this from a non-Mallorquin, and so I think I get much better service, because at least I'm trying to go along with the language. Yes, but as I say, the general trend is simplification, narrowing, and we just have to do our best round the edges, in which Tolkien, of course, has had a major influence. He persuaded people that they ought to know more about languages. So that's an entirely good effect. It can't be disproved. It's probably wrong, but I think I can see why Tolkien thought it. Our cradle tongue is completely caused by circumstances. You might say my cradle tongue was Nepali. That was the first language I spoke with my nurse, who was an Indian Gurkha. She spoke Nepalese. If I had stayed in India, probably I would be a fluent speaker of Hindustani. So that's, but if I'd been brought up in Japan, it would be Japanese. If I'd been brought up in, Russia, maybe it would be a Siberian language or something. It's just accident. But Tolkien thought that, and this I think is where he was wrong, was that all of us had some kind of language that was natural to us, probably ancestral. Well, we know that's not true. If a Swedish child is brought up in Japan, it will speak Japanese. Would it respond to Swedish and find it somehow natural? Well, I think Tolkien thought that was the case with him, that he did not know anything of the dialect of the early West Midlands, where his family came from. But he said that as soon as he was exposed to it, he found it natural and easy. Well, I think he wanted to think so. And if you want to learn a language, you do. So I always found, I've had to learn several languages in my life. My Latin is no good. I could never get on with Latin. My German is quite good. I learned German very easily and had no trouble with it. Other people say, oh, it's a difficult language, but I thought quite easy. But that was probably just because I wanted to learn it. It's not because I'm German in some way or other deep inside. I think it's just a case of, what attracts you. Well, I can't think of an experiment to test this except the one which was tried out according to Herodotus, where he says an ancient king of Egypt decided to find out what was the language that people naturally spoke. So he had some children brought up in total silence. Nobody was to say a word in their hearing, and he waited to hear what the first word they said was, because that was, as it were, the natural language. And as I remember, it was bekos, which is the word for bread in, I think, Phrygian. So he decided that Phrygian was the native tongue. Well, it was an interesting experiment, but we can't do it now, I don't think. We'd get into trouble, you know. Sometimes I write these proposals and I ask for a grant and I say, well, what I want is 12 infant children and support for them for 5 years, during which they are to live in total silence. And, you know, they never give me the money. I could never understand Owen Barfield. I think he is a philosopher, and I can never understand philosophy either. I think, again, there are some people who are good at looking at details, and there are some people who are good at sweeping the sky. Well, I'm one of the ones who looks at details. And Barfield, I have read, you know, quite a lot of philosophy, and I just can't understand it. They talk about abstract things, you know, like beauty and truth and platonic ideals, and I just don't know what they are. I think I'm not very good at this sort of thing, so I never really took much interest in Barfield. Um, um, I think I'd have to have. I think any paraphrase I made of Barfield would probably be quite wrong. Some time ago, you know, I had a dialogue with Franco Manni, the Italian Tolkien uh, um, uh, specialist, and he talked about philosophy, and I talked about philology, and really we were talking like this. We didn't kind of touch each other at all. We were talking about quite different things. So I think Barfield was a blank screen to me. I didn't understand it. I think I did understand the theory about the music of the word. I think it's quite true that languages have different rhythms. And my son, who is actually a very good linguist, he's quite bilingual in a rather odd language. Um, he said, "Well, Dad, if you're in a foreign country, the first thing you do is turn on the television in the foreign language." He said, "You may not understand it, but you get used to hearing it. Um, and that actually helps you to understand it after you've been listening to it for a while." And I think this is true. I say my German is quite good, but I, I'm slow to understand spoken German until I've been listening for a while. And then I get the different rhythm of it. And then I start speaking with the same rhythm, and it goes much better. So there is a sort of music of the word, and it's quite different, of course. You know, Italian is one thing, German is another, Spanish is different. They all, you know, there is something there, but it is very difficult to describe it. We can hear it, we can use it, but I don't know how to annotate it. Well, I think that's what Tolkien wanted to reach. He wanted to create a language which had a different music. And of course, he was quite successful in that. And I think if we looked at it, we could probably, well, the first thing we would do is make a list of phonemes. These are the small units of sound. Um, and then we would see which were the most used. And I'm sure we could actually make, then we could compare them with English, say, and say, there are more sounds like this in Elvish than in English. And then we would have to look at the way the syllables are constructed. And again, that would come out very differently. Um, and we could, I think, we get somewhere to describing the music of the language. But I think Tolkien probably understood that very well himself. and could probably have written out all the answers for us without thinking. He knew it already. And he was very, very careful to ensure that nothing could be used which sounded wrong. It was a problem he always had with translators. He was often unhappy about the way they translated names. And I think he preferred them to leave the names alone. Because they had their own music and they had their own rules, and he thought, and here I think he was right, that people can feel the rules even if they don't understand them. They feel the result, they don't know how it's achieved, but that's okay. That's all they need to know.